Episode 26. When reality becomes negotiable. If technology can reshape memory, replace community, outsource morality, and even tempt humanity to escape itself, then eventually science fiction asks an even more destabilizing question. What happens when reality itself can no longer be trusted? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last several episodes, we explored technological futures through deeply human fears. What makes someone human? What happens when memory becomes unstable? Whether technology can replace community? What happens when morality is outsourced? The fear of obsolecy, the temptation to transcend humanity itself. Today, we arrive at another question science fiction returns to constantly reality. Not physical reality alone, but shared reality. The collective agreement human beings depend on in order to trust one another, communicate meaningfully, build institution, preserve history, maintain community, and pursue truth together. Because science fiction understands something deeply important. Civilization do not collapse only when resources disappear. They also become unstable when people can no longer agree on what is real. That idea feels increasingly relevant. We already live in a world shaped by manipulated media, algorithmic information streams, curated reality, deep fakes, emotional propaganda, personalized narrative, and digital performance. And beneath all of that is a dangerous possibility. What happens when reality becomes fragmented? When every person receives a different version of truth? When technology becomes powerful enough not merely to distribute information, but to shape perception itself? Science fiction has been wrestling with this fear for decades. That's why so many science fiction stories feature simulation, manufactured memories, virtual realities, hidden systems, deceptive environment, uncertain identities, collapsing trust in institutions. Because the genre understands this, human beings can only survive uncertainty. What becomes far harder to survive is permanent instability. A world where nobody knows what is true, what is authentic, what is manipulated, and what can be trusted. Science fiction asks what happens to humanity when reality itself becomes negotiable. Because once truth becomes unstable, people often retreat towards tribal identity, emotional certainty, comforting illusion, system that reinforce existing beliefs. And eventually shared humanity begins fragmenting, not because people stop communicating, because they stop inhabiting the same reality. And that's where we're headed today. Not just toward deception, toward the emotional, spiritual, and social cost of losing trust in reality itself. No science fiction story captured this fear more powerfully than The Matrix. The central horror of the film is not simply that humanity is trapped, it's that most people do not know they are trapped. Their reality feels normal, convincing, and even comfortable. And perhaps even more unsettling, some people prefer it that way. Cypher remains one of the most important characters in science fiction because he exposes a deeply human temptation comfort over truth. He knows the stake is fake, he wants it anyway. That line matters because it reveals something uncomfortable. Truth is not always emotionally satisfying. Reality can be painful, chaotic, demanding, uncertain. Illusion can feel safer. Science fiction understands this deeply. People are vulnerable to systems that provide emotional certainty, identity reinforcement, pleasurable distraction, simplified narrative, comforting explanation, especially during periods of confusion or instability. And the Matrix keeps asking if illusion feel emotionally preferable, what motivates people to pursue truth at all? That's a terrifying question because civilization depends on enough shared reality for people to cooperate, trust evidence, hold institution accountable, and maintain moral responsibility. But once illusion become customized, truth itself become easier to avoid. And science fiction repeatedly warns us a society disconnected from reality becomes easier to manipulate. Not because people become unintelligent, because emotional comfort often outweighs uncertainty. Think about total recall. Total recall complicates reality in a different way. What if you genuinely cannot determine whether your experiences are real? The brilliance of this film is that it never fully resolved that ambiguity. Was it all implanted? Was it authentic? Does it even matter? Science fiction uses uncertainty intentionally here because identity depends heavily on perceived experience. Human beings construct meaning through memory, interpretation, emotional continuality, narrative cohesion. But once memory becomes editable, reality itself becomes unstable. And that what makes total recall unsettling. Not simply deception, but essential uncertainty. The inability to know whether your emotional life is grounded in authentic experience. Science fiction repeatedly asks if perception can be manipulated convincingly enough. What separates reality from simulation emotionally? That question becomes increasingly relevant in technological societies because people already experience reality through layers of meditation, like on screens, algorithm, feeds, curated narrative, edited imagery, selective framing. And over time, people begin responding emotionally, not necessarily to reality itself, but to constructed representation of reality. Science fiction saw this tension long before digital culture matured. The danger is not merely false information, it's emotional disorientation. When people lose confidence in their ability to recognize truth, trust itself begins eroding. And without trust, shared social reality awakens. Through other characterized as satire, the Truman Show functions like powerful science fiction because it explores deeply modern fears. What happens when reality itself becomes performance? Truman's world is artificial, but emotionally persuasive. Everything is curated, controlled, scripted, observed. And the horrifying thing is how ordinary the manipulation appears. People consume Truman's life as entertainment. Authenticity becomes spectacle. Science fiction repeatedly warns us about society where performance replaces reality, where people increasingly live publicly, performatively, under constant observation through curated identity. And eventually, individuals begin struggling to distinguish who they are from who they are expected to appear to be. That tension matters enormously Because shared reality depends partly on sincerity, the ability to trust words, intentions, institution, emotional expression. But system optimized for visibility can slowly erode authenticity. People begin performing constantly, and performance creates exhaustion. Science fiction understands this. A society obsessed with image would eventually struggle to sustain genuine connection because authenticity required vulnerability, and vulnerability becomes dangerous inside environments built around observation, ratings, and constant exposure. Blade Runner 2049 returns to this conversation through memory and intimacy. Kay's relationship with joy is emotional fascinating. Joy is artificial, programmed, responsive, customized, and yet Kay's experiences genuine emotional attachment. That matters because science fiction is not simply asking, can artificial relationship exist? It's asking what happens when emotionally convincing experiences can be manufactured on demand. Joy asks Kay exactly what he needs emotionally: recognition, affection, validation. And the tragedy of the story is not merely that joy is artificial, it's that Kay emotional needs are real. Science fiction understands something important. Human beings respond emotionally to perceived connection, which means simulation can still create genuine feeling. That creates enormous tension. If the emotional experience feels real, then what exactly makes it less meaningful? And perhaps more dangerously, what happens when corporations, system, or algorithms become capable of manufacturing emotional attachment at scale? Science fiction keep warning us about reality engineered not merely to inform people, but to emotionally shape them. Because emotional influence can become more powerful than factual persuasion. No modern science fiction series explored negotiable reality more consistently than Black Mirror, especially through episodes involving memory recording, social scoring, digital replicas, or simulated consciousness, media manipulation, or artificial emotional environments. Again and again, Black Mirror explores a terrifying possibility. Technology may become capable of reproducing reality convincingly enough that trust begin collapsing. And once trust collapses, people become emotionally destabilized because trust is not optional for civilization. Human beings need confidence in communication, evidence, institution, memory, relational authenticity. Without that, society drifts towards paranoia, tribalism, and emotional exhaustion. Science fiction understands that humans are not designed for constant uncertainty. People eventually seek certainty, belonging, emotional simplicity, even if those things come through distorted reality. That is why manipulated realities become dangerous, not simply because they deceive, because they emotionally reorganize society. And perhaps the most frightening thing about Black Mirror is how familiar many of its future already feel. Not futuristic enough to dismiss, just exaggerated enough to reveal patterns already emerging. So, why does science fiction care so much about reality? Because shared reality creates social stability, not perfect agreement, but enough common ground for people to communicate honestly, solve problems collectively, pursue justice, preserve accountability, and maintain trust. Science fiction repeatedly warns us that once reality becomes fully fragmented, community weakens. Because eventually people stop debating ideas, they begin inhabiting entirely different worlds. And this becomes emotionally exhausting. Constant uncertainty creates anxiety. cynicism, isolation, suspicion, and informational fatigue. And that mattered because emotionally exhausted population become vulnerable to manipulation, authoritarian certainty, tribal identity, and simplified narrative. Science fiction understands this pattern deeply. Truth is not merely intellectual, it is social infrastructure. And once that infrastructure weakens, civilization become unstable from within. One of the science fiction most difficult questions is this: do human beings actually want truth? Or do they primarily want emotional comfort? That question appeared repeatedly throughout the genre. Characters choosing illusion over pain, simulation over struggle, curated identity over vulnerability, certainty over complexity. Science fiction does not ask this cynically, it asks it honestly. Because truth is often emotionally expensive. Reality forces confrontation, accountability, ambiguity, limitation, and morality. Comforting illusion can feel psychologically safer, and technology increasingly offers sophisticated forms of emotional refuge. But science fiction keep insisting that a civilization cannot survive entirely on emotional comfort. Eventually, people must remain connected to reality well enough to recognize suffering, confront injustice, preserve accountability, and maintain meaningful freedom. Otherwise, system begin shaping perception itself, and people slowly lose the ability to distinguish truth from emotional reinforcement. That may be one of the genre's greatest fears. Not that reality disappears, but that people stop valuing it. So, after all these stories, what questions keep emerging? What does authenticity mean in technologically mediated reality? If images can be fabricated, if members can be altered, if voices can be synthesized, if relationships can be simulated, if experiences can be engineered, then what remains trustworthy? Science fiction does not give easy answers, but it repeatedly points towards something important. Authenticity is not merely technological verification, it is relational. Trust builds through consistency, vulnerability, accountability, shared experience, embodied presence, and emotional honesty. That is why so many science fiction stories ultimately return to touch, sacrifice, direct human connection, and live reality. Not because technology is automatically false, but because humanity required experiences that resist total manipulation. Otherwise, people become emotionally untethered. An emotionally untethered population are easier to control. So, what happens when reality becomes negotiable? Science fiction gives us a warning. Civilization may not collapse only through war, resources failure, or technological disaster. They may also fracture when people lose trust in truth, in institution, in one another, in their own perception of reality. And perhaps that is why so many science fiction stories fight so hard to preserve memory, authenticity, direct human connection, shared struggle, and moral accountability. Because those things help anchor reality socially. Still, science fiction does not ask us to reject technology, it asks us to remain conscious, to ask difficult questions about perception, manipulation, emotional influence, truth, and authenticity. Because the future may not only shape what people know, it may shape what people are capable of believing. And once that happens, human freedom itself becomes vulnerable. So next time we move toward another question science fiction returns to constantly. Not simply whether reality can be manipulated, but whether human beings can survive emotionally inside future defined by permanent uncertainty, loneliness, and isolation. What happens when entire worlds become emotionally empty? And that's where we're headed next. This has been the Sci Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember that truth matters not only because it informs us, but because shared reality helps keep humanity connected. And I want to leave you with a closing thought. If technology can perfectly simulate comfort, connection, and emotional certainty, would you still choose difficult truth? And what would losing shared reality cost humanity emotionally?